When people get murdered, the question we hear most is, why? Why did it happen? Why those people? Unfortunately, answers are hard to find in the Dumler Wilson murder case. It happened on October 22nd, 1969, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. The victims were Martin Dumler, age 29, his wife Patricia Dumler, age 27, and Mary Wilson, Patricia's mother. They were herded into an upstairs bedroom in the couple's beautiful Mount Lookout home. They were then tied up, shot to death, and then stabbed. Very little about this crime makes sense. It's difficult to pin down a motive, and the evidence is scant. This crime may even have ties to a different unsolved Cincinnati murder, one which you've heard about on my channel already. There are secrets and shadows swirling around the Dumler Wilson murders. Join me for a ride through strange and mysterious here at Odd Mysteries Stories. Come along as I follow the threads of this intriguing story. The papers described the Dumler family as socially prominent, and it sure seems like a good description. Marty was the grandson of artist and musician Martin G. Dumler, who was a well-known composer of religious music, a painter, and a local community leader. Martin Dumler Sr. was our victim's grandfather. He started at the Chatfield and Woods Sack Company in 1883, working as an office boy for $4 a week. By 1929, he had become president of the company. He would pass this title to his son, Marty's father. Young Marty was expected to take over the family business in due time. The Chatfield and Woods Sack Company business endeavors weren't very exciting. It made sacks, bags, and packages for various products. You can find pictures of some of their products today, such as flour and cornmeal bags. In 1969, the company was struggling and explored a series of new markets in the hopes of revitalizing revenues. The effort must have been at least somewhat successful, as the company continued to do business until the early 2000s. Marty worked as a sales manager. As such, he traveled quite often for work. Meanwhile, his wife, Patricia Ann, worked as a part-time model for Lillian's dress shop. Shortly before the murder, she accepted a second gig with an upscale supper club called the Fox and the Crow. Marty and Patricia were both old money graduates of the University of Cincinnati. They enjoyed a tight-knit social group of former college friends who shared their social class. The Dumlers held regular parties at their home and were members of the Cincinnati Country Club. Mary Wilson is considered to be unexpected collateral damage in this case. She was known as a doting grandmother. Mary was staying with her daughter and son-in-law after her husband suffered a heart attack. The police spent a great deal of time analyzing Marty and Patricia's business affairs. Marty had a gambling habit, and rumors swirled that he might have been making shady business deals on the side. But the police said the family finances were clean and apparently found nothing in the Chatfield and Woods Sack Company finances that could help them solve the murder case. Friends and family said the Dumlers had a good marriage with no extramarital affairs. The kids, Martin Dumler III, aged 5, and Jane Dumler, aged 4, were both in good health and seemed happy. So what dangers could have been lurking in the lives of either Martin or Patricia Ann? The children slept through the murders. When they awoke on the morning of the 23rd, they found themselves unable to awaken their parents, or even enter their parents' room, because the bodies were blocking the door. Still dressed in their pajamas, the kids shuffled over to the home of Mrs. Lobert, their next-door neighbor. This was just around the same time that the family maid arrived. Her name was Ruby Boner. The maid discovered the bodies and called the police. Then she asked Mrs. Lobert to watch over the kids. It was clear that the killer had forced Martin, Patricia, and Mary into an upstairs bedroom, then proceeded to tie them up with cords from the Dumlers' own appliances. The cords were yanked from lamps, televisions, and even an electric shoe polisher binding their hands and feet. It's possible the killer spent time speaking to the Dumlers, or even interrogating them before ultimately pulling the trigger. Martin had a gunshot wound in the right cheek. Mrs. Dumler suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and Mary also had a gunshot wound to the head. Police believed the killer had used a pillow as a silencer to keep the children from hearing the shots. All three were killed with wad cutters, or dum-dum rounds. These are rounds typically used for target practice. The ammunition has sharp edges and loses its effectiveness over distances of 25 yards. When used up close, as in the Dumler murders, they spread when they hit the target, making it very difficult for police to pin down the caliber of the weapon used. Police described it as a vicious bullet to use on a human being. Did the killer choose dum-dum rounds because that's what they had available? Or did the killer know that using those rounds would make the investigation more difficult? Or maybe it was the viciousness of the bullet they wanted, making the Dumler's death as painful as possible? Sometime after killing Martin, Patricia, and Mary with bullets, the killer brought out the knives. An already dead Martin was stabbed in the chest twice, and Patricia was stabbed in the chest 3 times. The killer then removed the cords and took them out of the house. Was the killer being overly cautious? Did they want to make sure their victims were dead? And what motive did they have for such a vicious, angry murder? Could it be some sort of unresolved rage with the Dumlers that inspired them to add a few unnecessary stab wounds to the mix? Regardless, the killer was professional enough and smart enough to wipe the crime scene completely clean. The only fingerprints in the house came from the victims. Police later said they thought the gun might have been a .38 caliber, but only because a neighbor had a .38 stolen from an unlocked car just 2 days prior to the murder. They have never found the murder weapon or definitively made any ballistic matches. The man who reported the .38 stolen also reported that it was armed with 4 wad-cutter bullets. Someone would have had to be familiar with the neighborhood to know that the gun was in the unlocked car and working the neighborhood 2 days before the murder to make use of such an opportunity. There was no sign of forced entry, leading police to believe that the Dumlers knew the killer. The back door was wide open by the time maid Ruby Boner arrived. The Dumler home backed up to a heavily wooded area that would have easily covered an escape. Chances are, the killer slipped out the back door and escaped into the woods. The nature and method of the killer suggests professionalism, yet combined with a lack of planning. The police have indicated they believe the killer was someone who knew what they were doing. At first, Detective Paul Morgan, the original responding detective, believed it was only one professional killer. By the time Cold Case Detective Kellyanne Best took over the case in 2019, the theory had evolved to encompass at least 2 killers. Both are said to be stellar detectives. Either way, there was so much evidence that makes very little sense. Why go through all the trouble of cutting appliance cords when the killers could have brought their own rope or tape to do the deed? Was the binding an afterthought, forcing them to work with whatever was there? If there was only one killer, perhaps the killer forced Marty to slice the cords before binding the victims. Maybe the killer knew they'd find something in the house they could use and decided to travel light. Also, why take the cords after committing the murder, but not the 2 knives used for the stabbing? The knives came from the Dumlers' own kitchen. Police found only 4 of the 5 bullets fired that night. 3 were recovered from the bodies of the victims, and 1 was from the floorboard of the bedroom. The 5th could have been lodged deeply into a mattress beyond recovery. The investigators worked hard on this case and did what they could to overcome the limitations inherent at the time. They questioned roughly 75 suspects at the station and conducted 20 polygraph exams, which every subject passed. They cased the neighborhood and spoke to over 200 potential witnesses. Police even wrote letters by hand to officers in Atlanta and Los Angeles to discern whether or not those departments had similar cases on file. They received over 500 tips, though most of those tips led nowhere at all. They carried away what reporters described as sacks and sacks of evidence, including a box of sandalwood and a red metal container labeled Private Keep Out. Of course, this box is a tantalizing mystery in its own right, but the nature of its contents have never been released to the public. Over the years, family members and friends have been somewhat quiet and reserved about the Dumler Wilson case. We don't know why that is, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. There appears that a local true crime writer did come into conflict with the family by hinting that they knew more than they were saying, which may have been completely inaccurate, with the family simply seeking to deal with the situation privately and directly with the investigators and not air their thoughts in the media. Why have the family chosen to be so seemingly secretive and quiet about this case? It's tough to say, but it's important to recognize that both the culture of the Dumler Wilson social class and the culture of the times might have lent itself to a great deal of grieving in private, with few displays or conversations in public. All indications show that Dumler Wilson's family members and close associates have cooperated with the police at every turn. So, what do we know? At this point, we know for sure that the crime was not a robbery gone wrong. Both Patricia and Mary were wearing expensive jewelry, and the killer or killers left cash in the house. We also know that Martin had an argument with a man on his driveway the day before the murders, though it does not appear as though anyone ever identified this man. One witness reported seeing a man sitting in a car near the Dumler house at about 8:10 p.m. before Martin arrived home that night. The cops ruled out murder-suicide. Witnesses also say that the family seemed in good spirits and didn't seem to think anything was amiss that day. We also know that the police say that the killer probably remained at the scene of the crime for some time after the murders. Both the stabbing and the waiting around afterwards could indicate a cool professional who was committed to making sure the Dumlers were dead and who wasn't going to leave until he knew the job was done. Did someone target Marty Dumler to keep him from stepping into the president's chair at Chatfield and Woodsack Company? Apparently, Marty often spoke about ousting his father as president and complained that his father had made several bad business deals. He'd also been arguing with his brother-in-law, Keith Kepley, who served as the company's corporate lawyer. Keith Kepler is not currently a suspect. He has an alibi for the night of the murders, and their relationship was still good enough that Keith was calling Marty to set up squash games on the weekend of the murder. It's also possible that Marty had some information related to a federal case. One of Martin's friends was in the middle of testifying at a federal trial, a monopoly case regarding a concrete company that had done some sort of business deal with Chatfield and Woods. Still, an antitrust suit seems like a thin thread on which to hang a murder case, and to our knowledge, neither Marty nor Patricia was directly involved in the concrete company's woes. Any corporation certainly would have had the means to hire killers who showed the same level of professionalism as the Dumler Wilson murderers showed, but there simply isn't enough evidence to create a firm connection. Homicide Squad Chief Russell Jackson believes it may be simpler than that. He believes that Marty had created some shady business deal with the man in the driveway and got in over his head. In this theory, Martin Dumler tries to cut an unethical deal with a far more seasoned criminal, but he talks too much and makes his partner nervous. The speculated criminal then kills Marty with Patricia and Mary Wilson as collateral damage to cover his own tracks. If this is the reason, the killer might have remained in the house as long as he did to remove all traces of his association with Marty Dumler, then stabbed them before leaving just to be sure they were dead. This suggests a seasoned criminal, but not necessarily any kind of hitman, and offers perhaps the strongest explanation for what may have happened that night. The Fox and the Crow Club was rumored at the time to have ties to local organized crime. It's not clear what Patricia would have done at the club, as she probably wouldn't have been modeling dresses at a supper club. Investigators have observed that Patricia Ann might have been the primary target of the murders, since she was stabbed more than the other victims. If so, is there a chance she saw or heard something at her new job that she was never meant to see or hear? Even the perception that Patricia might have witnessed something incriminating might have been enough to get her killed, whether she actually did or not. Unfortunately, we don't have much evidence that the Fox and the Crow Club was ultimately anything more than an upscale club, and we don't know whether Patricia's new gig could have led to the demise of her, her mother, and her husband. When Detective Morgan took on this case, he mentioned that his mentor had always told him to look closely when a murder takes place. Murderers almost always know their victims, and the motive is almost always personal. There are hints in this case that looking closely might be a good idea. First, many of Martin's friends were big gun guys. Many of them had .38s and had reloading equipment that included wad cutters. While most of those friends used shotguns, not pistols, wad cutter ammunition would have been a common sight in Martin's social circle. Martin himself was a gun enthusiast, and the murderers might have known that Martin had 2 guns in the home on the night of the murder. Still, the murderers chose to bring their own guns rather than relying on Martin's, and might have tied Martin and his family up to keep them from reaching the guns. Again, though, this is a thin thread on which to hang any speculation at all. Targeting rounds would have been an easy purchase to make, and plenty of people owned guns at the time. The only hint that there might have been dissension in the friend group came from Martin's sudden and quick-moving relationship with Patricia. Before her, he'd had a long-time girlfriend of 5 years named Sunny Piers. They broke up, and Marty married Patricia 1 year later, a rather fast marriage by anyone's standards after such a long relationship. Perhaps Patricia Ann was already pregnant with Martin III at the time, or perhaps Martin and Patricia really hit it off well together. But if Sunny Piers or any of her associates are considered suspects, such a link has gone largely unreported. It would be easy to read a great deal into that relationship, but it seems a poor rationale for a murder that would occur at a much later time. Patricia Ann Dumler was renowned for her attractiveness. While this blonde bombshell seemed happily married, she had sought anxiety treatments from a local psychiatrist. Dr. Armstrong's notes indicated that she'd been receiving numerous crank calls in the era of landline phones, calling a strange home, saying nothing or breathing heavily into the receiver was a common crank call. It was a technique that stalkers often used to intimidate their victims. In addition, the owner of Lillian's dress shop reported that Patricia had been harassed by an overly attentive male customer just a month before the murders. Was Patricia the victim of an unhinged, crazed killer who spotted her, wanted her, and couldn't have her? Did her husband and mother become collateral damage? It is absolutely worth noting here that there were no signs of any kind of sexual assault at this crime scene, and all the bodies were fully clothed, which could rule out any kind of a sexual motive. Still, nothing demands that a stalker get sexual, even if his feelings of rejection fuel his desire to commit such a heinous crime. If you'll recall, the Bricca family murders took place in Cincinnati in 1966, just 3 years before the Dumler Wilson killings. The Bricca family home address is only a 25-minute drive from the Dumler address. There are some haunting similarities between the 2 cases. Jerry and Linda Bricca were about the same age as Martin and Patricia. Both cases involved a criminal who bound the victims and stabbed them. The killer used knives from the victim's kitchen in both cases. Both cases also seem to involve a murderer who was not new to killing in any way, shape, or form. There are differences as well, though, and the devil is in the details. For example, in the Bricca family murders, the murderer appeared to bring his own rope and tape, though he also took the rope with him after the deed was done. The Bricca family murders did not appear to involve a gun, though it's possible the Bricca killer brought a gun that was never fired since they got the family bound without using it. Also, 4-year-old Debbie Bricca was brutally murdered alongside her parents. However, in the Dumler Wilson murders, the young children in the house were spared. The police did explore a connection between these two murders. As of right now, they do not believe the two crimes are related. Do you think the similarities are too great to ignore? In September 2017, a Bruckner Society plaque was found on sale for $5 at a Smithville, Texas garage sale. The plaque honored Dr. Martin G. Dumler, Marty's grandfather, for his work in the Bruckner Society of America. The Bruckner Society started by celebrating the work of Anton Bruckner, a German musician. Though Bruckner's music carries some disturbing connotations, given that the musician was a favorite of Adolf Hitler and many prominent Nazis, the Bruckner Society of America seems to remain focused on a harmless enthusiasm for classical music. The plaque appeared to have been intended for Xavier University in Ohio, though the Bruckner Society journal Cord and Discord reported that it was presented to New York University in Lower Manhattan. Either way, there was no connection to Texas, leading one to wonder how a portrait plaque ended up so far down south. The Bruckner Society story that discusses the plaque notes that they had to track the plaque down from someone who purchased it from that same garage sale, although not the seller, before the Bruckner Society could reclaim it from the garage sale directly. Oddly, there was a mention that the buyer shared a last name with one of the murder suspects. This is weird for two reasons. First, no suspects have ever been named, at least not in open media sources. Even the speculation about this case fails to name any suspects. How did the Bruckner Society determine that the person who tried to buy the plaque and take it home had the same last name as a suspect? Did they mean the name of a suspect the police had looked at and then ruled out? Or did they merely make a mistake when reporting the story? The person who donated the plaque is unknown. Witnesses mention a woman in a small gray truck, but nobody knows who she is or where she came from. This creates yet another question and story that's full of them. Police will tell you that the only way this 50-year-old crime will ever be solved is if someone who knows something comes forward and shares what they know. So, of course, I am compelled to ask, do you know something about this crime? Be sure to share with me what you know in the comments below, or share what you know with Cincinnati Crime Stoppers, linked in the description below, to help Martin Dumler, Patricia Dumler, and Mary Wilson finally receive justice. This is another sad, perplexing, and mysterious crime that remains unsolved. I only hope that one day the surviving family, including the children that were obviously affected by this crime, one day receive the closure I'm sure they would welcome. I hope you enjoyed this video and are enjoying the videos on my channel. My name is Vince, and if possible, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting new videos at least once a week. Clicking the little bell will send you a notification when a new video is posted. In the meantime, I invite you to watch one of my other two videos on your screen. Thank you.